Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Today we are talking about the next step in our research process. Now we have devised a topic, we've reviewed some of the scholarly literature, we've devised an analytical research question which speaks to that literature and which fills in a gap in our knowledge about the topic. Now it's time to propose a theory and an empirical hypothesis that speaks to that research question and that helps to connect the dots conceptually in our minds between the independent variable concept and the dependent variable concept. This is a stage that we've already been previewing in much of our research process so far. Generally, you don't come to the table with a research question without at least some inkling of an understanding of the theory that drives it. But this time we want to be explicit about that. And as we're writing our papers, as we're writing the sort of front end, that is the piece of the paper that comes before we do any data collection, measurement, analysis, or conclusions, this is going to come to represent one of the most important pieces of the front end that we can consider. So again, if we've got our research question that we've devised, we've got this, very convenient conventional format that we've put into place, and many of you, if not all of you, in Composition 1 have gone through and put this exact statement in there, which is exactly what you want to do. What is the effect of IV concept on DV concept among some population? And if you've got those pieces together, that means that you're well on your way. But the theory section of the paper becomes a really important one, because this is the part of the paper where you're going to explain your logic as to why you think that there is some kind of effect, some kind of influence, some kind of impact of the IV on the DV. Again, we want to know why the heck that is. So why do we expect this influence? And again, just as important, and perhaps even more important for the analytical research design segment of our study, what kind of effect do we expect? If we think that our IV concept has an influence on the DV concept, what is that influence? Is it going to cause an increase in the DV concept? Is it going to cause a decrease in the DV concept? Is it not going to change the DV concept? This type of effect is what we want to know about. And in order to do that, in order to explain our logic as to why we expect some specific effect between the IV concept and the DV concept, we need to put together what's known as a theory. So the theory ultimately is, in my opinion, the most underappreciated stage of the research process. And this might be because, like me, you may have downloaded R on your computer and RStudio, and you've typed in some math in there, and you've typed Hello World, and you brought an Excel data set into RStudio, and you've analyzed some of the various columns of that data set already. And that's amazing, and it's so fun. And you feel this power at your fingertips, like you can do all this cool data analysis. However, data analysis in service of an unspecified theory is nothing useful to us. We can type, commands into accurate, good commands into RStudio for 24 hours a day and still know nothing substantively about the political processes that we're trying to analyze without a good theory. So again, we've gotten a taste of that world, but we've got to back up and we've got to think about our concepts. We got to stay in the world of conceptual understanding before we get down and start analyzing the relationships between data. And in fact, I've mentioned during the unit on the literature review that I'm often a reviewer of articles. And this isn't to say that I'm a really grumpy reviewer. I try as much as possible to be constructive. And, if I think that a paper is well constructed, I'll be the first one to say I love this paper and send that to the journal, right? But when I review articles and I see that the other reviewers around me, and sometimes I agree with them, sometimes I don't agree with them. But if this article gets rejected that I've reviewed, it's most likely because either me or one of the other reviewers or all the reviewers together have identified that the theory is lacking in substance. And I'll say, other reviewers will say, why do you expect this relationship? What is the theoretical mechanism that explains logically why we should expect X to have an effect on Y? I think it's one of the biggest reasons. Often reviewers think, or scholars think that reviewers are going to nitpick them on their research methods, and they're going to say, "Oh, you did this wrong with the statistical analysis of your data. There's some sort of problem with the math there." I find that more often a bigger issue comes down to the theory, actually. So it's something we need to spend as much time as possible perfecting, even before we start envisioning working with data. So again, to sort of summarize what I'm trying to say here, we can analyze the relationship or the correlation between any variables in the world that we want. But we need to be able to explain to ourselves why we would expect those correlations to happen, why it would make sense for there to be a relationship present in the first place. And so one of the biggest issues here that we can think about is this issue of spuriousness. Okay, so there's many different instances in nature. Variables trend together a lot of the time, actually. We'll see that patterns exist in data very frequently, very commonly. Okay, and in fact, I've got a little website here that we'll go to in just a second that really shows you some of the extreme nature of this spuriousness here and there. So let's go to that website and we'll talk a little bit more about what spuriousness is through some examples. Okay, here we are. This is this Tyler Vigen's Spurious Correlations website. And you'll see here that it's actually now a ridiculous book that you could get. It's all about correlations that have no theoretical basis. And I've got a couple here that I want to focus on because I think that they really run the sort of spectrum from ones that are maybe plausible to ones that are absolutely not plausible. And so I really like this one, right? You can see here that from 2000 to 2009, if we look across time and we have these data points, you can see that the red line here represents the total revenue, the total amount of money generated by arcades. This correlates with very well, in fact. This explains more than 98% of the variation in the number of computer science doctorates awarded in the United States. Now, if you're like me and you want to think really stereotypically, you could say to yourself, aha, I think actually there may be something to this. There may be some reason why these two series tend to go together. Maybe it's because whenever there are more arcade, people playing games in arcades, right, from 2000 to 2009, right, maybe these people who are playing all these arcade games are also interested in computer science because they like computer games, and so they go to the arcade more often. So more computer science PhD students are driving up the revenue generated by arcades, and that's why these two things are going together. There's a cause and effect story here. Okay, let's be fair. Let's be real. There's not a causal relationship here. This is a completely spurious relationship, and you could make this argument. You could try as hard as you can to make this extremely tenuous argument. That computer science doctorates are spending more money at arcades in these years when they earn more doctorates on average than they did before. Okay, but the problem is, right, there's a lot of holes in that logic, right? First of all, there's a lot of computer science doctorates who don't go to arcades. And in fact, so many probably don't go to arcades that we would not imagine that there would be a relationship here. Not only that, but there's also a lot of people who do go to arcades that are not computer science doctorates, right? And in fact, it could be that these two trends going up have nothing to do with one another whatsoever. We could also think about this, right? If I were to think about, what's going to drive people to STEM and maybe make them computer science doctorates, maybe it's kids who played arcade games way when they were like children or something and got interested in the design of these things and then eventually found their way into computer science programs. These things wouldn't happen in the same year, right? They'd happen in a much more lagged way. And so again, we can talk about these particular relationships as much as we want, but there's an extraordinarily tenuous case to make that these two things are related. And again, this is probably the kind of thing that has the most in line with one another of these various trends, right? So if we go down here to the number of sociology doctorates awarded, here we can see again, this is a pretty strong correlation, 78.9% of variance explained. There's some kind of relationship here, apparently, between how many people get sociology doctorates and worldwide non-commercial space launches. And so, I don't know, maybe these NASA folks are, I guess, decide every year that sociology doctorates get awarded, that we need to explore space a little more. I don't know. I mean, again, there's no relationship here. There's no reasonable reason behind these correlations. This just happens to be part of the random process of data generation. It just so happens that these things go together. Another one, right? Maybe it is the case that if you really want to get a civil engineering doctorate, you should eat a lot of cheese, right? Again, there's absolutely no real reason why these two things go together. And here I'll give you an even more extreme example, right? So here's the year over year from 1999 to 2010, the year over year rate of people, apparently in the United States, I assume, because this is a CDC data series, right? This is the number of people in the US every year in this series who drowned after falling out of a fishing boat, and the marriage rate in Kentucky. So you can see here that the marriage rate declines precipitously across this time period, along with apparently boat safety increasing. So good to see that fewer people are falling out of fishing boats, but maybe not so good to see that the marriage rate in Kentucky has declined so much. However, does this fishing boat hazard have something to do with the marriage rate in Kentucky, right? Are we making the case here that all the people that didn't fall out of fishing boats here who just went and immediately got divorces, I guess, maybe because they got a new take on life or something and rethought all of their commitments or something because they survived their fishing boat accident? No, that's completely ridiculous, right? And so the idea here is a lot of things trend together in the social world. These phenomena just happen to look related. And in a random data set of completely computer-generated random data, it's very likely that we're going to see at least one set of correlations that are quite strong correlations that mean absolutely nothing. So in order to ensure that we're not falling victim to this kind of spurious correlation kind of world in our own research projects, we've got to have a really good convincing argument as to why divorce rates in Maine correlate with consumption of margarine, why cheese has something to do with the people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets, why your own political variable has some influence, causal influence on another political variable. This is the important step that we need to take to ensure that we're not chasing numbers around and finding a relationship that really doesn't mean anything useful in our studies. So let's go back to the slides. So we just saw some really bad examples of spurious correlations, but I want to think about theories that are good now, right? Actually good theories. So, for example, we might ask the question, what causes someone to adopt a progressive ideology? This is, again, the exact kind of line of questioning that would work well for topic generation in this course. And if we think about this, we can, map out a whole complex diagram of potential causes. We can think about all kinds of different things. The influence of parents, the influence of schooling, for example, people's socioeconomic status, all kinds of stuff, right? Influence of spouse, all different influences that are all having some kind of influence on the ultimate outcome, which is whether or not somebody calls themselves a progressive and whether they don't. And so if we think about all of these different possible causes, maybe we're interested in socioeconomic standing on progressive ideology. Maybe we think that that is an important link, and that forms the basis of our research question. Maybe we say, what is the effect of socioeconomic status on willingness to adopt a progressive ideology? We have to remember that there's all kinds of other complex causes out there that are also contributing to this beyond just our, IV concept that we've labeled, that is SES. And so in order to do solid theorizing, we have to do some things. And first, of course, we have to make the argument as to why SES actually has an impact on progressive ideology. Why would people with lower SES be more progressive? Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe people with higher SES are more progressive. We need to think about these things, right? First, as I've just mentioned, they need to posit either a negative independent association or a positive independent association between an independent variable and a dependent variable. That is the key to the idea of an independent variable, is that this is something that is not dependent upon other kinds of forces that are actually serving as intermediaries or go-betweens between the concepts. And so we need to make the case that socioeconomic status has an influence on being progressive that doesn't have another cause in the middle that's actually what's really going on. So there's a causal order here as well, that socioeconomic status causes you to become more progressive, higher or lower, whichever one you want to argue. Maybe we could say lower, right? Lower SES, if you're not making as much money, you're not doing as well in the economy, that's going to make you more progressive, right? It's not the other way around. It's not the fact that being more progressive makes you not make as much money, right? So like if you were to say, wake up the next day and say, oh my gosh, I've had a change of heart. I listened to Bernie Sanders and he told me things about the economy and I've decided to be a progressive. all of a sudden, like, your bank account like is slashed in half, like through some kind of magical property. That would be reverse causation. And so we have to be very clear and careful that that kind of reverse process where the progressive ideology causes you to lose SES isn't what's really going on. We'll see some other examples in our class discussion where it was much more plausible reverse causality. This one, it seems a little bit more straightforward, where your SES is something that is more durable, something that comes from your whole lifetime of choices. Your decision to identify as progressive is something that may come out of that set of decisions instead of going the other way around. So causal order is also a really, really important piece of this. And then again, finally, the most important thing here is that there's no, we might call backdoor path or a source of spuriousness. That is a reason, a legitimate reason why SES is not really the culprit in determining why you become progressive or not. That there's some sort of other possibility where progressiveness is related to another variable that also explains your SES. And so maybe that has something to do with, like, for example, your political party affiliation. And so if the story is really that your political party affiliation is what's driving these two variables, we have to think very carefully about what to do in that case. And that's why theorizing is so important. We have to think throughout the front end of our paper about all the possible effects, all the possible causal narratives that influence our outcome, our dependent variable. This is why I've assured many of you that we keep that research question as simple and as clean as possible, because the theory is where we start to build back in a lot of the complexities of the reality of our case. And with that complexity comes a much more difficult, a much more interesting, potentially interesting, but also a much more complicated story. And so our theory necessitates that we think very carefully about all these different features of the relationship. We have to be careful, right? We have to be especially careful of the influence of what we might call intervening variables. Just as we were talking about this idea of partisanship maybe serving as the true link between your socioeconomic status and whether or not you call yourself a progressive, we have to be very concerned about the idea that these things are stand-ins for what's really going on. We might also be concerned about antecedent variables, and that is something that comes before socioeconomic status, which is also influencing our progressivism and really, again, becomes the main story. So, for example, we could think about parents' SES. Maybe parents' SES is what drives our SES, and therefore also what determines some of our political ideas as well. So again, that's not something we should maybe be hugely concerned about in this case, but in your own research, you might occasionally encounter antecedent variables which tell a more compelling story than the variable that you yourself have chosen. And then, of course, as we've mentioned, a really big theoretical problem is this issue of reverse causality, and something that I have to be completely straightforward with you. Many Poly 301 research projects are going to have some element of reverse causality that needs to be contended with. We will not be able to solve the reverse causality problem in this class, but we will at least be able to address those things and bring them up in our text so that readers are cautioned that some of these relationships that we're observing may fall victim to some of this reverse causality problem if we were to conduct that study as is. So lastly, in this unit, I want to talk a little bit about fallacies. Okay. Theories are notoriously difficult to talk about, notoriously difficult to specify, because they also require us to think really carefully about our unit of analysis, right, and how that relates to our population. And so it may be that, again, depending on the sort of level of zoom in your microscope, whether you're looking at individual people, or whether you're looking at states or countries or regions or cities, right, depending on that unit of analysis, that level, essentially of zoom that you have in focusing on your subject, certain fallacies can come into play. So one fallacy to be aware of is something called the individualistic fallacy, which is what happens when you infer a characteristic about a group on the basis of a single case. And so that is something that comes into play when you've got individuals and you're analyzing them and you're saying, oh, well, this kind of insight will apply to explaining, say, the way that states are different. That's not necessarily the way that this works, because states as an aggregate group unit are potentially going to behave differently than all the individuals collectively. And that's actually something that we need to be aware of. The opposite of this is the ecological fallacy, which is inferring a characteristic about an individual on the basis of groups. So that's, I think, a really great example of this is to think about red states and blue states. So, for example, California. California is notoriously a blue state. It voted for Hillary Clinton, and it voted for Joe Biden, it voted for Obama, it voted for Democratic politicians for a long time. Going back, obviously, to Reagan, who was popular in California as a Republican instead. But this sort of blue state moniker for California means that a lot of people might think, oh, like the average Californian's this like latte drinking, like liberal yuppie or whatever living in San Francisco or something, when forgetting that actually California is home to more Republicans than any other state. They just so happen to be substantially outnumbered by Democrats, but there are 5 million Republicans in California that are out there. In many rural areas as well. California is an enormous state and has a lot of rural places too. And so making an assumption about an individual based on the political description of California as a unit actually is not fair to the diversity of individuals within the unit. And so we have to be very careful about that, especially those of you who are doing analyses at the state level or the city level or the country level. It may be that there's substantial within unit heterogeneity, or that is sort of spread or variation within those states that we need to think carefully about. So these are all some issues that can arise in our theory development. We're going to be seeing a lot of examples here in a little while. But in the next video, I'm going to be talking specifically about how we might capture some of the core insights of our theory into a specific format. So follow me along to the next video, and we will talk about hypotheses.